With the open source, you're trying to build the community. A crucial part of open source is having that critical mass of people that will not only use your product but also contribute to it. One of the huge challenges of open source is that it's not necessarily automatically sustainable. You need people to stay interested in it. You need people to stay contributing to it. I think we're going to see a lot of differentiation there in the next couple of years about what you're actually trying to do and what kind of model you need to use for that, so you don't eat up all your resources, but you're still providing the level of service that's needed.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Everything Outside Code. And on these episodes, I talk to a fantastic GTM expert, a CTO, CMO, a founder about the very hard parts of going to market. And today I have Paul Zimmerman on. Hey, Paul.
Hi, William. Happy to be here.
Yeah, great. Thanks for coming on. And to anyone listening to this, today we're going to be talking about open source and developer advocacy. Paul has spent probably a greater portion of his life working on developer products, spent a couple of decades at Uber, not at Uber, at
Newly at
Cisco.
Uber, I spent a couple of decades at Cisco.
Yeah, yeah. I was like, Uber hasn't been around for that for that long. Yeah, so I spent a couple of decades at Cisco and newly at Uber, mostly working on developer products. And an interesting part of developer products, which is open source products, not just open source products, even more fun, going from closed source to open source. So in this episode, we're going to be talking all about developer advocacy, OSS projects, and how those work. So we just get right into it. How is developer advocacy at open source projects, open source products, different from developer advocacy at closed source ones?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Working on an open source project, you have to do a lot of thinking about your contributors and who you're working with. When you're working on a product for a closed source that you're trying to sell, you have kind of a more of a focus on your market and, are people going to buy this and trying to sell the product. With the open source, you're trying to build the community. You're trying to get your contributors to get interested in it. You're trying to get people that are not contributors but are going to be consumers of that to understand the value of it. And it's definitely a different mindset than working on a company's product rather than going for an open source type of environment.
Yeah. I also, would you agree that you'd also have to think about motivations of a lot of individuals, a lot of the contributors as well? Because while success for you could be, want an ecosystem to be better, for individual contributors, it could be different. I used to maintain an open source project for the Gatsby ecosystem in JavaScript land. And I remember one of the core contributors, his motivation was just he wants to get promoted at work. So, and the company used the plugin I was maintaining. So he was just committed to like ensuring the plugin worked. That was his motivation, not love for open source or wanting to give back. So I think like that's probably a motivation you would have to think through. Did you get to face some of that?
Absolutely. I'm working on this open source product for Uber now, but previously at Cisco, I was on the Open Daylight program, which was a Linux Foundation, or it currently still is a Linux Foundation open source program. And I was helping build their content wiki at the time back in 2010s, probably 2010, 2011. I was working on that. And seeing the different motivations is very interesting. Not everyone is motivated for the same thing. As you mentioned with your example, you're working with different people from different companies. The companies that they work for may have their own reasons for being on an open source project. The individuals also have their own reasons for doing it. And one of the challenges I had in Open Daylight was actually getting contributors to contribute and to stick around. So it's nice when a company wants to be a sponsor for an open source program, because then there's a little bit more motivation for the people to stick around because the company is telling them to. But otherwise, people have their own individual ideas about what they want out of it and how long they want to be a part of it. That's another challenge, is that it's kind of it can be a rotating door of contributors if they don't have a strong motivation for sticking around. With Michelangelo, which is the Uber platform that we're open sourcing right now, we're a little bit earlier in the process. We have, some partners that we're working with that are very interested in contributing, and we're still kind of pulling that model together for that. But it's also kind of a different world. Back when we were doing Open Daylight, it was about software-defined networking. It was a change in the whole mindset of networking in general. With AI, it's a whole nother thing. So Michelangelo, maybe I should give an introduction for that, just so people know what I'm
Yep.
talking about. So Michelangelo is Uber's machine learning platform, and they're making parts of it open source now. Hopefully, the whole thing will be open source at some point, but it's a modular kind of thing, and it happens over time. It's used for building, training, deploying, and managing open source or machine learning models in production. And Uber has used this platform since about 2016 internally. It's giant. It does massive things. It trains 25,000 models per month. It has 6,100 models in production at the same time, and it's just this massive scale of being able to train AI, or being able to do the machine learning aspects of AI. So it's kind of a different world. Back when we were doing Open Daylight, it was this transition from people doing a lot of CLI and working that way. We're working with a lot of hardware for networking to the software defined model. And so in that one, we really needed to train developers on how to use code, or I actually had to train network engineers how to become developers, how to use
Yeah.
code, how to, you know, get the programmability in, how to understand how the programmability function works in networking. With AI and machine learning, it's a whole different thing. There's so many aspects to it. Developers don't only have to learn APIs and coding, but they also have to learn model selection, data workflow, how to evaluate your different models, orchestration and agents. It's a whole different dimension than it was back in the 2010s.
Yeah. So I can see how that shift would be a lot. For anyone listening, the software defined networking era or that change, I think this was around like 2011, right? So like the
Yeah,
early
that's about
2010s
right.
was basically networking companies saying, hey, you don't need to program routers and networking devices and switches that much. You can move all of that programming out of it into like a different software layer so that the software can drive any hardware out there. I can imagine what this would mean for like the big players then that were, determined to make like very complex switches and routers and keep monopoly and, refuse interoperability if they had to at the time, and that sort of changed it all. And then Cisco open sourcing Open Daylight. That was also pretty interesting. So I'm curious. You spent 25 plus 26 years at Cisco, and then moved to Uber. What did Uber offer that Cisco couldn't?
Uh,
Maybe here I'm trying to get into
well,
your career now.
we can talk about my career a bit. I spent a long time at Cisco, always in engineering groups, doing different stuff. I got into developer relations, about 12 years ago, right about the time software-defined networking was taking off. I was, as many people have been affected these days, I was unfortunately impacted by a layoff at Cisco, which opened me up to get this role at Uber. So it wasn't 100% by
Mhm.
choice, but I'm actually very excited about it. This whole aspect of getting into developer advocacy for machine learning has been great, and especially getting
Yeah,
into the whole open source thing. Again, I did open source stuff at Cisco, as well as as well as supporting their products. But this whole Michelangelo machine learning platform is it's just so impressive, and trying to get it out there for people to use is just really exciting. Uh, but yeah, it wasn't
yeah,
100% by choice, but it's a nice. Sometimes you got to shake things up, so
yeah.
it worked for me.
That's interesting, and it sounds like you're working on Michelangelo. That's pretty impressive. I know, pretty short stint, but at this point, where do you feel developers are stuck when they come or want to try out Michelangelo? What does the data say at the moment? How do you find out where they are stuck as a developer advocate? How do you do that?
Uh, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. So when a developer lands on Michelangelo, it could be the GitHub repository.
Oh yeah.
Are you able to tell where they're stuck and the process to adopting it? How'd you do that?
Yeah.
Like specifically, what does the data say around like Registock? How do you instrument that?
Yeah, so it is currently hosted on GitHub. You can go to michelangelo-ai.com to find the actual to find our webpage, which will link you to the repo. There is some getting started information there. We are still kind of in early beta, so you are able to set up a sandbox and play around with it a bit. But we will be doing some a bigger launch later in July, and then moving forward. So yeah, right now we have certain aspects of it available. We have things like the Uniflow Orchestrator and Michelangelo Studio, which is kind of the user interface. We have some of the controllers and artifact store available. So it's still there's still the whole thing isn't available yet, but there are aspects of it that are available. And then we're
Hmm.
working with some of our partners on them building sections of it out. So it's becoming this great thing that is based upon what Uber has been working on for the last 10 years, but we're getting the input from our contributors and from our the people that we're working with to make it a bigger, better platform that everyone can use. And I think a lot of this is trying to influence the ecosystem, trying to make sure that we have the interoperability with a lot of the people. You look at Uber's app, and there's Uber Eats and there's Uber Rideshare. There's other aspects of that. We're connecting with different vendors, restaurants, airports, everything else to bring all this stuff together. It's a giant
Hmm.
orchestration effort, and to be able to make this open source gives people the ability to kind of build some interoperability, build some standards around it so that everyone can connect in a much better way.
Yeah. Now, that's great. So you talk about like working with partners. It's currently some of it is open source. How do you know that they're having a great experience with it at the start? At least now that you don't have a lot of data on their usage, or
Right.
are you able to collect any of that information? How do you currently know this is, they're having a great developer experience or we need to tune up something somewhere? What does that look like at the moment?
That's a fabulous question, and that is where community plays such a huge vital effort. You know, we can put stuff out there, but if people aren't using it, how do we know if people are having success with it? So we need to be able to get that feedback. So a lot of that is through our community efforts, building forums where people can respond, meeting with people at events and things like that where we can present this and talk with them about it. We're trying to host some workshops where people can actually get some hands-on and give feedback back to us as well. So yeah, it can be challenging for open source, especially if your community isn't super engaged. And ours is still pretty early in the process, so we're still trying to build this. But we're working directly with a lot of our partners and talking with them on a regular basis to hear what their issues they're running into. Of course, they're opening issues in GitHub, but just seeing an issue in GitHub doesn't mean we're hearing all the things that people are having struggles with.
Hmm.
So to get that community conversation going on is just so important. And again, we're still kind of in the early stages here, so that's still being built. But I know from previous efforts that is really where we hear from people through community efforts, through both online communications as well as the in-person kind of meetups and things like that, where we can get the feedback from people.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, these community efforts are definitely useful. And what number do you typically track that lets you know that, yeah, this community effort was real and it's not just a vanity metric, right? Because some, how do you know, what
That's
number do you look at and say like, this is working?
that's a fabulous question. I think for an open source project, adoption is kind of the name of the game. Are people actually getting a branch and building on it? Are they actually using it in their not only in their sandboxes, but also are they moving towards production with it?
Hmm.
So it's I think a lot of it comes down to adoption. Certainly satisfaction and happiness with the product is great, and for a lot of in company products that matters. For open source, though, I think adoption is really the key. Are people using it? Are people contributing to it? Is another thing.
Hmm.
It's one thing to take a free platform and build on it, and that's great. But to get that contribution really shows if there's engagement happening. So I think those two aspects, adoption and engagement, are probably the two biggest
Yeah.
biggest things we can measure.
Yeah, that's great. Still on community, I know at Cisco you built the community from the grassroots, like right with grassroots efforts from the ground up instead of taking like a top-down approach during the pandemic. So I'm curious if you could walk me through what were the literal first moves to get something growing from the bottom, especially something like community these days that's like super important. Everyone wants to invest in community because then you own like people that could become fans of your product. So how'd you go from 0 to 1
Mm.
with community
See,
at a product like
that is that is the kind of the whole crux of the issue is building that community. One of the projects I worked on at Cisco was the Cisco Doc Wiki, which was a collaborative, publicly facing wiki, and that we built from the ground up, and that was really challenging getting that critical mass of people to contribute to it. Luckily, at Cisco was or it still is a giant company, tons of products, tons of people engaging with it, and so that made things a little bit easier in that there's a lot of people that want to find out about Cisco and work with the products and their the whole IT world. Cisco is kind of the backbone of all of that. So that made things a little bit easier in getting people engaged. With Michelangelo, it's a little bit more challenging. Those who are in the machine learning world have heard of it to some degree. It's been fairly famous in terms of its usage within Uber and how it's connected everything and made the Uber platform so successful. But making it open source has been, it's still early in the process. So really trying to connect with the community is one of my big challenges right now, honestly. And again, we're early, so that's part of the nature of it. So we're not behind
yeah,
the eight ball or anything. It's just part of the nature of growing something that hasn't been open source before. So things like that, we need to get the word out. We need to we're starting to do some conference rollout where we can give this presentation to people who are interested. We're connecting with a bunch of our different partners and letting them know about it. But yeah, one of the big challenges right now will be building out that community, because that is such a crucial part of open source is having that critical mass of people that will not only use your product but also contribute to it. And I think that we have a great opportunity here, and I'm pretty excited about doing it. But yeah, we're kind of in the early stages still with Michelangelo. People that have heard of
yeah,
it who are in machine learning, but to get everyone on board here is one of my big efforts right now, honestly.
yeah, yeah. That's cool. And maybe not with Michelangelo, with Cisco that you did for a while. I'm curious, when building out the community that you built out, what did you deliberately not do, even though like leadership or anyone else would expect that you would do that, but you're like, no, not going to do this because it's not going to get us anywhere.
Wow, that's a great
Any
question.
things like that?
That's a great question. To me, again, not only for open source, but for developer connections in general, community is just such a huge important thing. But to me, even the things that seem a little off the wall, if they don't impact the budget too greatly, I think that's a great thing to try to get excitement. You might have to try different items. I know that at the Cisco communities, I was managing the community for a while, the developer community, and we tried all sorts of different stuff, and then some of it worked, some of it didn't totally work. But really, you got to try things. We tried things like daily engagement posts to get people not only coming to get there for support questions and stuff, but to come for other reasons. Let's
Hmm.
talk about different aspects of technology. Let's just try to get the engagement going and have people communicate about things. And a lot of people just come to these communities for support, for questions and issues. So that can be a mixed bag in terms of success, but to try to get your community to be more exciting and engaging, I think is really crucial. You got to give people something that they want, though. It's not just about posting memes or whatever else. It has to be something that's useful to them. That's kind of the big difference, I think, to me, between standard marketing and trying to support developers, is that you don't want to sell stuff. Developers want something that they can use. They want something that they can sink their teeth
Hmm.
into. They want something that's going to help them with the efforts that they're doing. So I think the biggest thing to help people is to give them something that's useful. Something that, as your question came up, what are things that maybe aren't so helpful? Uh, the noise. trying to sell something too hard or trying to put up something that's cute and silly but not necessarily helpful to somebody. The noise is the issue, I think, for the most part, is that you want to make sure that you're cutting through that and giving people stuff that they need and want.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. On open source, one thing I think I mentioned it before we started this chat, and something I want to push on. A cynic would say companies open source parts of their platform to control the shift. It could be to lock in mind share, protect their margins underneath, not necessarily to be generous. We've seen that in like the web development landscape where sort of like the big web players, platform providers, sort of own open source projects that drive web development. Either they own Next.js or Nox.js or even Gatsby. From the inside, having been at two of these shifts, right, with Open Daylight
Hmm.
and now with Michelangelo, is this true? How much of it is true with large corps wanting to maybe cement mind share or just own a lot of the value chain as against just
Mm,
contributing to open source and supporting open source?
that's a fabulous question as well. Wow, you're full of great questions, William. Thank you. The Wow, that so with Michelangelo, it's still pretty much an Uber effort that we're getting out there, but we are starting to pull in our contributors and getting their feedback as well. Open Daylight was an interesting project because Cisco was one of the ones was and maybe still, I'm not sure they still are if they're still a sponsor, but they were. But also Juniper and I think and some of the other big networking companies of the time were also all part of this. And so how do we what who how do you control the mind share? Who's driving it? And that's kind of a wow, that's a great question on how's that determined. I know that with Open Daylight, it was pretty cooperative. We didn't really get in the parts that I was working with. We didn't have a lot of conflicts, but I think at the time, and maybe this is the case with a lot of open source stuff, is that we're trying to set standards. We're trying to get people to work similarly, and then that was the thing with Open Daylight was that when people are trying to do the programmability for networks, they want to be able to program all of their equipment, not just their Cisco equipment, not just their Juniper equipment, not just their Arista equipment. They want to be able to do it all. And so I think people were pretty open on the contribution side to contributing to that and to making things work together. Certainly, companies are going to have their things that they want to push.
Yeah, because
They want to make sure that it's working for them. And why are they participating in this at all to try to influence the ecosystem? But I
is that
think
the main
cooperative.
reason?
I'm sorry, what was that?
No, I'm just curious, is that sort of like always a chief reason? I mean, from being on the inside twice now, is that a reason to like open source it? Is like there's a ploy to control, the ecosystem, and
Oh,
I'd I'd say like set the standard, right? That others
yeah.
should follow.
That is a huge reason for people going open source is to try to influence the ecosystem and try to have a foot in the door and have some sort of influence over everything. And I think that was one of the huge reasons for Cisco participating in Open Daylight and probably all of the other companies as well, trying to do that. Who's going to come out on top and who's going to have the greatest influence. So that's one of the challenges as one of the people on the steering committee of one of those open source projects is to kind of moderate that, make sure that not if it's going to be open source, it shouldn't be just one company managing it. It should be this
Yeah.
collaborative effort, especially something like a Linux Foundation project like Open Daylight. We want everyone to contribute to it. That's how people adopt that and then are able to use it with all their different systems. There's a lot of reasons for going open source. Adoption is a huge one. Influence, building the ecosystem, building standards is a big one. Making sure that the way that it's set, the standard that's set in the open source project, if people are using it for free, they're going to adopt that standard, and then that de facto becomes the standard that everyone uses. So influence is a huge reason to go open source. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. And in practical terms, right? So looking at Michelangelo, for instance, when Uber open source is something that it's run for nearly a decade, right? That powers what 25,000 model development runs and a couple of thousand actual models, there's there's no denying that there is a huge business moat in this because it's driven the business for a long time.
Hmm.
What does it actually keep for itself? Like, what is worth keeping? And I'm trying to figure this out for teams out there that are like, we need to open source parts of our application, but how do we go about it? So, what's worth keeping? What's worth open sourcing while still satisfying both the ecosystem contributing to it, but also still protecting the business and saying, like, oh, yeah, the business is also good, but we're also contributing to the ecosystem. How do you kind of like arrive at that decisions? And how does the developer also get a read on it?
Yeah, yeah, interesting question for sure. Uh, Gosh, so I think that companies, of course, they're going to protect their bottom line. They're not going to try to give away the farm for things like that. Example for Cisco's example for Open Daylight was, they're at the time software defined networking was kind of a watershed moment. It was like, are people going to stop
Yeah.
buying routers and just go software and just do it all through software, or they buy these black boxes that they don't have to buy a expensive Cisco router. They can just buy this, you know, bare metal and run software on it. So for Cisco, it was a kind of a live or die moment. For Uber, I think this is more of just building the influence and getting this out there so that people can participate in it. And I think it is, not everything in Michelangelo is becoming available open source, but a good chunk of it is, and I think a lot of that will help bring in some of the other companies that work with Uber. They get more interoperability going on and similar workflows, then things can work together a lot better. But yeah, I don't think people open source things to undermine their bottom line. It's more to enhance it and to build that influence. So yeah, you're not going to see like Microsoft giving away Windows on open source, or Uber. I don't know. Yeah, so I mean, people are going to protect their bottom line for sure, but they're going to try to
Hmm.
use this open source aspect to build the influence and yeah, put it
Yeah.
all together that way. I think.
I think, yeah, I'd imagine that a distinction that will be made, obviously, is resource requirements, right? Teams would want to open source stuff that doesn't require internal resource to run. So rather than having, say, Michelangelo hosted on Uber servers or Uber's infrastructure that would run the machine learning model development, the training, packaging, and the delivery, pretty much AI models today could figure out how that would be done. I can imagine that picking up Fable 5, you might come up with something close to how Michelangelo would work, right?
Mm,
Today, because AI models are already trained with like corpus of like similar projects over time. So maybe you could come up with that, but Uber is incentivized to, you know, provide their opinion with Michelangelo. Now, this is my opinion is Michelangelo is basically Uber's opinion today of how model development, packaging, training should be done, because otherwise you would still do it, but probably you would do it wrong. Now, running it on your own infrastructure, that's fine. You're still going to spend like not everyone's going to want to host. Every developer would want to host Michelangelo. Probably it'd be suitable for like large teams that actually want to run their own like model MLOps, right? Like their own
mhm.
model development operations on it. So I see it as sort of like you can expect as a developer that to open source something, you see as a company finally sharing their opinion of how something should be done, wherein you know how it would otherwise, you know how it could be done, but you don't know all of it. They just share,
Mm-hmm.
here's our opinion of how it could be done. But I would also expect that the crust of it, like the core of what powers Uber from with Michelangelo probably wouldn't be out there, right? Because then that puts the company at risk. And for any developer out there thinking about open sourcing stuff, and there are products like Superbase, for instance, that I use as a web developer, that is open source, but you know that it's either the cloud infrastructure Superbase runs Superbase on, it's probably optimized for Superbase, right? they keep those engineering secrets specifically for themselves. Like Vercel running Next.js or any other product that has an open core, right? Or an open source version. That's what I would that's what I would expect. I'm curious as a developer advocate during this like transitional periods, right? Because you did that with Open Daylight in the STN era, and now with Michelangelo. Was there was there a bet that didn't pay off the way people hoped, right? So we want to open source this because we want to set a standard, or we want to open source this so we can get more market share, or we can get our opinion out there just for marketing reasons. Has there been a time when this bet didn't pay off? What did that cost the developers that bet their careers on it, right? So this thing has gone from closed source to open source, and then suddenly it's like everyone's bought into it, but it's no longer being maintained, or no one cares as much. Has that happened? Has that happened before, where this open bet just didn't pay off the way people hoped?
I haven't personally been part of something like that. I mean, I was happy to see looking back at Open Daylight. I looked at their site recently, and it's still going on, even though I think it's definitely reduced in influence at this point. But I think everyone has adopted a lot of those ideas about controllers and the structures and things like that now. And so things do evolve over time. At some point, maybe the open source aspect of it isn't a crucial driving factor anymore, and so things can wind down, and that is an issue. I think you look at things that are adopted by CNCF or by Linux Foundation. Well, then you have usually a core group of maintainers that stick around and make sure that things stay at least viable to some level.
Hmm.
But that's certainly a huge concern especially with products that are maybe open source that aren't adopted by a large organization like CNCF or Linux Foundation. Yeah, they can die out there, and then what do you do? I guess one thing you need to look at, I suppose, would be, are there better, more modern ways to adjust to that? I guess in some cases, people would just have to purchase something that a company has created, rather than stick with the open source one if it's not being maintained. That's one of the huge challenges of open source, is that it's not it's not necessarily automatically sustainable. You need people
Hmm.
to stay interested in it. You need people to stay contributing to it. If people aren't contributing and helping keep it going, it probably will wither and die. And then what do people do who have adopted it? They're going to have to find something else. And yeah, working on an open source, you bring in open source components to your system. You have to make sure that it's going to be something that sticks around. You look at. I'm trying to think of an example. Well, different tools. Maybe the most recent versions of it aren't compatible, or maybe they've reached a level where they're not updating it anymore, and it doesn't work with your current software levels and packages. So, gosh, it's a huge issue, I think, to make sure that things stay maintainable.
Hmm.
And I think part of that is something that you brought up earlier, was how do you know if people are using it? How do you know if people getting that feedback? And I
Hmm.
think that also comes back a lot to the community and paying attention to what people are doing. Are people using this thing still? Are people contributing to it still? It's something that, as a someone building a someone being a system architect, needs to pay attention to when they're building their system. If they're using open source components, are these viable components that are going to continue to be maintained and updated?
Yeah. I actually have a buddy that works at Hero Devs. Because of him, I learned of the company Hero Devs. And Hero Devs basically takes like deprecated or like unmaintained open source projects and maintain them on behalf of their customers, right? So a
Mhm.
large customer probably uses like a 2010 version of something. It's working. It's just there. You dare not update it, right? Or it's like the current version is probably like deleted with vulnerabilities. It's no longer being maintained.
Uh-huh.
Now Hero Devs adopts a version of that and maintains it on behalf of their clients. So they are basically heroes for open source projects on behalf of their clients. So I think that's a fair point, and it's even more valid because folks have built like probably millions of dollar worth business around
It,
around that.
yeah, it's a trade-off. It's do if you're going to buy someone's product, you're going to expect them to support it until until you stop paying for it or whatever. But if you're using open
Yeah.
source, you're using this, you're trusting that someone's maintaining this, that someone's contributing to it, they're making sure that it stays secure and that it's not full of bugs and all that kind
Hmm.
of thing. So there's a lot of trust that goes involved with building into open source. A lot of you know kind of understanding that you're not going to get the support that you're going to get
Hmm.
from a product that someone is paying people to support to provide support and things like that.
Yeah. I've been thinking lately about like first developers contributing to open source projects, but not just developer advocates supporting developers, like supporting products for developers. And with AI, I'm starting to think, what is even the durable skill? And I want to get your opinion on it. Uber's own engineering team and engineers currently generate a lot of code with AI agents. So, as developer advocates, we are agent advocates almost, right? Because
Oh
we're
yeah,
creating content, we're creating a lot of artifacts for agents, sometimes without even knowing it, right? So, as a
absolutely.
developer or developer advocate, what are you advocating for in this world where developers now use a lot of AI? What's the durable skill at this moment?
Well, it's really been a huge game changer, I think. I've been able to build things that in time that I had never been able to build, at least in a short amount of time, like previously. Coding assistants like Codex and Cloud Code are giant. They're huge. They're used by everyone now. Agents, giant too. That helps move things along. People can run tests and things when they're not even in front of their computer. The agent can take care of all that stuff. We are starting to see things like token usage and stuff becoming more of an issue for people. So I think that we're going to be seeing that become a bigger issue in the next year or so. I think, some companies, Uber's been in the news about it recently. I think Microsoft also is in the news about it recently about token usage and how that is becoming an issue. So, but you can't turn it off. You can't just say, okay, people are just going to go back to coding without assistance or not using agents to help run their tests and all that kind of thing. It's a game changer in terms of how it makes people code. So it's going to be an interesting ride over the next couple of years, I think, to see how people use that and how they adapt to it. One of the things is I think that Michelangelo can help with this too, people using different types of models. Surely the foundational models or the frontier models are going to be great for some of the biggest things you want to do, but not everything needs that. You can use some of these open source models. I built a chatbot when I
Mhm.
was before I got my job at Uber, and I was using RAG and trying to and having it run. It used a small language model. That's all it needed. It didn't need to have this giant reservoir of of knowledge. I have my RAG that gave it the information that it needed,
Mhm.
a lightweight model worked fine. And so I think we're going to see a lot of choices between using frontier models and using more open source models. I think we're going to see a lot of variation there. And again, I think Michelangelo feeds into this to a large degree in that you can support a bunch of different models depending on what your needs are. So I think we're going to see a lot of differentiation there in the next couple of years about what you're actually trying to do and what kind of model you need to use for that, so you don't eat up all your resources, but you're still providing the level of service that's needed.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think last week within like the AI ML space, the talk was mixture of models, right? How do you mix and match models so that you get great performance at the best price possible? Because now everyone's talking about like token budgets and token
Yeah,
consumptions and teams are scaling back usage. I saw somewhere today some company introduced like onboarded the team to AI agents in coding and then turned it off after a week because an engineer just blew 80 grand in the first week. You're like, all right, we're not doing this. Not now. We're gonna go under. That's probably the cost of hiring like 4 or 5 engineers if they're in the
absolutely.
US. Yeah, so that's definitely something to think about.
But yeah, I think for a lot of coding, even for developers who are using coding assistants, you don't need Opus for everything. You don't need certainly don't need the super giant models for everything. I've been using Sonnet and I've been pretty happy with what I'm getting out of it. It all depends on what you're trying to do. If you're building production software, yeah, you maybe want to use something that's a little bit more beefy and that's going to make sure that you get your stuff done properly. If you're building demos and things like that, you don't need something quite as strong as that. So yeah, it's what you need is people trying to decide what they need and hitting that level for their appropriate usage.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So I'm curious, right? As if a company so strip Uber's resources at the moment, right? Let's look at a 10-person company that wants to open source part of their product tomorrow and build a community around it. That's the reason they want to open source that part. What's the one
Mhm.
thing they should do first? And what's the tempting thing they should ignore if this smaller team that doesn't have Uber's resources was going to like open source part of their product? What's the first thing they should do? What are you currently doing at Michelangelo without Uber's influence?
I think the first thing that you need to do is listen to the developers that are out there and figure out what they actually need and what they actually want. I mean, you can build whatever you want, but if it doesn't meet someone's needs, then what's the point? So really, you got to listen. You got to hear what people are struggling with and what things are going to make them more successful. And that's how that it not only gives you a more viable product, but it also gives you the into that community. What are people needing to do? What's going to make their lives easier? And for developers, again, it's not about buying a fancy new gadget or whatever. It's about what am I going to use to be successful? What's going to help me the most with what I want to get done? And so you got to understand your audience. You got to understand what if you're trying to focus on a particular kind of developer, what do they need? What are they struggling with? So listening to them is the most important thing. What you don't want to do is just put something out there for the sake of putting it out there because you think it's a cool gadget or something. Earlier in my career, I worked at a startup, and it was a it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of cool stuff that engineers were saying, "Oh, I'm going to build this, and it's cool." But I think that comes back to understanding what the needs are for your customer, for your audience. If you're building for developers, you got to hear what the developers need. You can't just build a cool gadget because it's cool. You got to build something that people are going to want to participate in. And building that community, you want to build something that people are going to talk about and maybe share with their colleagues and say, hey, this is a cool thing. You want to be there so that people come in with questions. There's someone that they can talk with, and someone that there's that human connection where people can actually get a better understanding for what you're trying to do and how it helps them.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thanks. And to close out, I'm curious. So you've seen these two shifts up close with Open Daylight and now Michelangelo going from close to open. What do you believe about open source and the developer community now that the younger Cisco version of you would have argued with?
Wow, that's a great question too. Wow, you're full of great questions for sure. Wow, what would I do? How would I speak to the younger me about open source?
About
I
open
guess
source and
one is to
dev
keep.
communities.
I'm sorry, what was that?
No, I was saying about open source and dev communities. What would you talk to
Yeah,
your younger self about?
gosh, I think I would tell myself to keep an open mind and to go with the flow. One of the things about open source, and especially working with something that where you're getting a bunch of outside contributors, is that if you're too set in your ways, you're not gonna catch that flow. You're not gonna catch what people are hearing and what people really want. And these things are gonna develop over time. They're gonna grow kind of in their own ways that maybe you didn't plan for initially, but you got to hear what other people are wanting, what other people are doing to contribute. And I wasn't opposed to this when I was younger. I certainly was open to hearing what people are wanting and doing, but I don't think I fully grasped the importance of it. So I think that is probably the deepest thing is really understanding your audience, and that's with the truth of so many things.
Yeah.
But it's also always the lesson that keeps on coming up. You got to listen to people, you got to understand what they want and need, and you got to be flexible. So I've always tried to be flexible, but it's something that I just gonna keep telling myself: don't get stuck in your rut. Be open to the universe and to the things that are coming in, and move in that direction. And I think that that's the truth with technology in general. It's not just with open source and not just with developer advocacy or developer relations. I think it's the truth in technology in general is that if you don't evolve and learn, then you get left behind. So I think that's my lesson across all of my years in technology is that you got to keep learning, you got to keep growing, and you got to keep moving forward.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great. Yeah, keeping an open mind and not being stuck in one's ways because being younger, there's usually a lot of like ego. I've got a stronger gut feeling. I think this is the way we should go. But older, you learn to listen more and see like what exactly folks want. So that's a great one. What's the best way to check out Michelangelo? I've checked out the GitHub repository. I've looked at the documentation. I guess just typing in Uber Michelangelo, you find it already with Google search, right?
Yep.
That's great. That's great. And what's the best way to find you, Paul, if anyone watches this and wants to have questions about
I'm
Michelangelo?
on LinkedIn. I'm Paul Zim on my LinkedIn profile. I have a portfolio, paulzim.github.io. You can check out all the stuff I've done there as well as connect with me. Yeah, my GitHub repo is my GitHub ID is Paul Zim. So feel free to connect with me there too. And yeah,
Yeah,
I'd love to connect with people, talk with people, and see how I can be of assistance.
yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming on this episode. It's been a blast. I've learned a
Thank
lot
you, William. I
myself.
really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, and that was today's episode of Everything Outside Code. And I'll see y'all on the next one. Cheers.
Cheers.